Good afternoon, and thank you for your warm welcome. You're looking very peachy and relaxed in the sun, but I hope that we've got a bit of energy for a bit of what we might call political revival and spiritual revival, because I've called my talk "Curating the New Politics?" ? Can the church convert welfare provision into political and spiritual revival? I'm going to explain what I mean by curating the new politics a little later on, but I suppose if I was to cut to the chase of what I'm going to try and do in the next 45 minutes, it would be to say I think there's a profound change going on in our society. There's a kind of zeitgeist moment. I sense there's a huge disillusionment with politics as usual, with economics as usual, with business as usual. And I think there is a kind of search for hope, a search for hope politically, a search for hope spiritually. And this is despite the fact that we're a wealthy nation, but, you know, we've got material happiness. Most of us are lucky enough to have the things that we want, but of course we're a society that's facing increasing inequality and division. And I think there's a search for a political narrative going on at the moment, which is about restoring decency, transparency, fairness, and trust back in the public sphere. And I see a gentleman there with a Corbyn T-shirt. Welcome, sir. I'm wondering whether the interest in what Jeremy Corbyn's doing and standing for, irrespective of whether you're going to vote for him or whether you're a Labour supporter or not, whether he's tapping into this zeitgeist in some way for a new type of politics that returns back to these values. I remember he said, what's your pitch to the British public? And he said, I want a fairer society where no one's left out. Says it all beautifully, I think. But I also think maybe that we're looking as a nation, as the United Kingdom, we're looking for a national kind of narrative about who we are. What sort of nation are we? What do we stand for? It's very hard to find out. And I think alongside that, the church is also in a zeitgeist moment, looking for something, looking for hope. I think for the church, it's looking for relevance and connection. How can the church connect up with these aspirations, deep and longing aspirations for change, which nevertheless are not particularly coherent? They're deep, but they're not particularly coherent. One of the reasons why I'm director of the William Temple Foundation is I love William Temple. If there's such a thing as ancestor worship, I'm probably there within a kind of Christian tradition. William Temple, as you know, most of you I think would know, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1940s, died in 1944, but in 1942 wrote a book called Christianity and Social Order, where he tried to identify the principles by which we could create a decent society. And he worked very closely with Beveridge in basically creating the comprehensive universal welfare state as an expression of what the state's role was. The state's role is not to control you as an individual. The state's role is to provide you, he said, with the basic building blocks that you need to flourish. So he was into people flourishing and communities flourishing. And he said this, which is a kind of touchstone, and I think sets up what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes. He said, the church must announce Christian principles and point out where the existing social order at any time is in conflict with them. It must then pass on to Christian citizens acting in their civic capacity the task of reshaping the existing order in closer conformity to those principles. So in the spirit of William Temple, I think I'm asking, what does that mean today? What does it mean today for us, those of us who are engaged in church, engaged in other faith groups, but in fact engaged, or what I'd say, people of good faith? What does it mean for us in our current context to do that task that Temple lays before us, to reshape the social order towards just and progressive ends? So in the time that's left to me, I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, what I'm calling the zeitgeist moment, this moment of uncertainty, this moment of searching. How's it come about? I think it's come about through global reasons, through globalizations, but it's also come about through local reasons. What I hope to do in my analysis of this zeitgeist moment, this moment of change, potentially this moment of uncertainty and searching, is to highlight why I think religion is well placed to, if you like, capitalize on this search. I'm going to talk a little bit about public policy and how public policy initiatives like localism are creating new spaces of engagement. This is, for me, what it's about. It's about new spaces of engagement and connection. I'm probably going to offend a few people here when I say I'm not that interested in theology. What does this mean theologically? I'm interested in what it means pragmatically, practically, because Temple was a great pragmatist, a great experimenter. So I'm interested in unpacking that. And then I want to just give you a couple of case studies of different faith groups, one a Muslim food bank, one a Christian initiative behind a local currency, which I think exemplifies how faith is moving into these new spaces of politics and curating them. And I'm going to say what I mean by curate, as I say later on. So how do we find ourselves where we are now in the 21st century? The 21st century is a very different century to the one that was envisaged in the 20th century and the 19th century. Part of the uncertainty of the age, I think, has been a kind of fairly, what you might call, catastrophic collapse of confidence in the project of modernity, 19th and 20th century modernity and secular modernity. And of course, the pet project, if you like, of secular modernity, the thing that it created was the nation state. The nation state became the replacement for religious belief. The nation state was there to claim your soul, to claim your allegiance, to claim your trust, to claim your faith. But the nation state, towards the end of the 20th century and into this century, finds it increasingly difficult to control anything because of globalization, because the power, if you like, has shifted away from the nation state to the market, the neoliberal market, and globalized capitalism, which doesn't recognize any boundaries. So we're in a very fluid, unbounded world, politically and economically. And I just want to introduce you to, well, not physically, he's not here, but metaphorically, to a German philosopher and social thinker called Jürgen Habermas. Has anyone heard of Habermas? Oh, good. Yes, good. Habermas trained as a Marxist, really. He went to the Frankfurt School of Sociology, which is the Marxist School of Sociology, and in a way, he's a secular William Temple. He wanted to work out how can we create a cohesive global society. But he wasn't that interested in religion. He thought that we could create a communicative society through kind of universal statements and understandings of what these statements meant. So it was a very kind of rational, propositional understanding of how you run the public square. He's since radically changed his tune, and he says that, in his opinion, we need to reimagine the public sphere, not as a secular one, where religion is privatized and, if you like, banned to the edges. He's saying we need to reimagine society as a post-secular society. So he's the first person, if you've heard of the concept of the post-secular, he's the person who really came up with this in the early 21st century and has been working on it ever since. And he says, so what's his definition of the post-secular society? He's not saying that religion is replacing the secular, although I think in some ways it is. He's not saying there's a kind of going to be a dramatic reversal in secularization. But he says the post-secular public square is this. He talks about the vigorous continuation of religion, the vigorous continuation of religion in a continually secularizing environment must be reckoned with. So I'll just say that again. He says a post-secular public sphere is one in which the vigorous continuation of religion in a continually, I can't really say that word, but you know what I mean, secularizing environment must be reckoned with. So we got more secularism as a kind of ideology. I think secularism is still alive and well in certain parts of the media and certainly in academia. And it likes to still present itself as the main narrative going on. You've got ongoing secularization, which I simply interpret as kind of modernity. It's change. And change is accelerating all the time, and it's changing everything. It's not just changing religion, it's changing the secular as well. But then you've got ongoing religion. And if there is a narrative about the 21st century, it is the re-emergence of religion on the global scale. The new visibility of religion, some might say. But let's just think about the UK. Does it really feel in the UK as if there is a continuous, a vigorous continuation of religion? Hands up those of you who think that's right. Who would support that statement, that there is a continuous, a vigorous continuation of religion? A few? Is there anybody who disagrees with that statement? Okay, a few. Sometimes it feels a bit countercultural in the UK. I'm not talking about the world, I'm talking about the UK, to talk about the vigorous continuation of religion. Because we are, I think, assailed almost on a weekly basis with doom and gloom statistics about the decline of the established church, the mainstream denominations within the Christian context. I think just last month in The Independent there was an article that said that the Church of England will be extinct within a generation. Does it have to be that long? No. That's very cruel. That's very cruel. Oh, it's being recorded, so I can't retract that. Never mind. And there is, I think, a narrative about the decline of religion, and there certainly is, without doubt, a decline in what you might call religious literacy. So that's an understanding of what religion is. And I think there's a steep decline in British people, shall we say, understanding the Judeo-Christian roots out of which their democracy emerges, out of which their art and culture has emerged and still continues to do so. But I do kind of want to challenge, I think, a kind of a doom and gloom assessment of what's going on, particularly if we look at globally. I mean, I hear a lot of people say, oh, we live in a post-Christendom world. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure it's true. And when Habermas talks about the post-secular and the re-emergence of religion on the public sphere, globally he is absolutely right. There was a recent survey, I don't know whether you saw it, by a research organisation called the Pew Research Foundation, which does regular tracking of global religion. And based on several thousand surveys and censuses, but also based on population trends globally, they say that by the time we reach 2050 and our population is something like 9 billion, the number of people who claim a religious affiliation will have increased from 84 to 87%. And the number of people who define themselves as not religious, i.e. as unaffiliated to a religion, will have declined from about 16 to 13%. So we live in a very, very vigorously religious world, for better or for worse. And sometimes it's for better, and sometimes it's clearly for worse. Within the UK, that report suggests that we might be in a kind of post-Christendom environment. It says that, projects that by 2050, those who claim a Christian affiliation will be 45%, those who claim an Islamic affiliation will be 10%, and those who claim to be no religion will be 39%. But that seems to me to absolutely characterize what Habermas is talking about. You know, ongoing religion, ongoing secularization, ongoing secularism. So I think this creates a very interesting environment in which to work. It's just worth saying, and I think I've got time to say this, that people are now interested in secular studies. So we're used to religious studies, but because the numbers of people who define themselves as not religious is growing in certain countries like UK, like the US, like Australia, like New Zealand, is that me? No. I thought it was feedback. What was I saying? Yes, this is the dangers of trying to do live thinking aloud, isn't it? Secular studies. Thank you. So so when people say that they're not religious, or they define themselves as no religion when the census comes around, it's actually a very, very interesting group of people. Some research in the States has identified, and you may have heard of this, it came out about a year ago, I think, or 18 months ago, identified 6 different types of people who define themselves as not religious. These include the cultural non-believers. So these are people who probably grew up as in a faith tradition, have switched, if you like, from that allegiance to what they would define as not religious, but still retain a strong interest in their religious roots and find it of interest and even help to them. There's what they call the activist, atheist, and agnostic. A lot of these categories are atheist and agnostic, actually. It's interesting. They're not clear-cut atheist. So these are people, these are activists who are very much committed to equality and environmental issues. Then there's the anti-theists, the kind of the people who would subscribe to the writings of people like Richard Dawkins. Then there's the ritual atheists and agnostics. So these are some of the people who are slipping into our cathedrals in ever greater numbers and sort of lapping up the liturgy and the symbolic cultural richness of that. Then there's the seeker agnostic. Seeker agnostics are people who are very open to the spiritual way of life, to the non-material, shall we say. And then there's the non-theists, and the researcher in America who did this is almost sneering at this point, because he says there's a very small number of people who define themselves as no religion, who actually can't be bothered to believe in anything. He kind of calls them the slackers of the sort of the no religious world. But basically what he's saying is that even within the context of what you might call no religion, there's a huge variety of positions and beliefs. And it seems to me that part of the new politics is finding ways of engage with people who have beliefs and values, clearly, and ethical concerns, but who would choose not to darken the doors of a church or an official or institutional religious establishment. And part of that kind of mapping of the no religious personality, if you like, also reminds me of the other key point that Habermas is interested in when he says that we live in we're moving from a secular to a post-secular, or we need to move from a secular to a post-secular imagination of the public sphere, is that part of what's driving him to say that is a very clear moral as well as empirical set of questions. And he basically is saying that the traditional Enlightenment virtues of autonomy, rationality, individuality, private property have become distorted, and that, if you like, those positive Enlightenment values have become subsumed within what he calls a kind of perversion of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. So if you like, neoliberal capitalism is a kind of the not very good progeny of the Enlightenment in his analysis, because what it's doing is it's hyper accentuating ideas of individuality, of materiality, of consumerism, and he says it's stripping out the values of public life, our public values as a society are being stripped out by neoliberal capitalism because of its emphasis on a distorting emphasis on individuality, autonomy, materialism. So he says, well, how can we rescue the liberal democratic state? And he says, well, the liberal democratic state needs to return back to religious values, to religious truths. He says the liberal democratic state needs to rediscover the wisdom, the discernment, and the discipline linked with religious sources. And he calls these sources pre-political, because he says these are sources that can't be molded or shaped by the current political trends that are being acted upon. They stand outside and beyond. They are, if you like, I don't know whether he would use this terminology, they are, if you like, a kind of transcendent form of truth, knowledge and wisdom that the liberal democratic state needs to reconnect with. So he says we need to reframe the relationship between faith and reason, and we need to discover a more mature ethics and politics. And he says it makes a difference whether we speak with one another or merely about one another. I'm just going to have a quick liquid refreshment break, excuse me. So we've probably had enough of Habermas, haven't we? Although I think he's interesting, and he's certainly given us, some of us, a lot to think about. So just to recap, before I move on to the next stage, that I think we're living in a part of this zeitgeist, part of these new spaces and opportunities for connection are what I would call a post-secular paradox. The post-secular paradox is, yes, at one hand, the church, institutional religion, is in decline institutionally. There is a decline in religious literacy, but set against that, within our in particular context in the UK, you've got a huge interest again in the role of religion. The world is as religious as it ever was, if not more. And at an individual level, I think you've got huge numbers of people who are searching for, in that kind of postmodern way, are searching for a more authentic life, a life beyond the selfie, a life beyond the narcissistic selfie, where they can reconnect their values and beliefs back into the public sphere. So that's the question I'm moving towards. Is this true? And I'd be really interested to hear whether what I'm saying resonates with your own experience. But I suppose the crucial question for me is the church, is religion in this country up to the task? Have we got what it takes to connect, to engage with the post-secular public sphere, where the rules of engagement are being rewritten all the time, and where people's identities are quite fluid and soft and not essentialized and hard. So I'm interested now in talking about, for just the next 10 minutes or so, about these new political spaces that I think are emerging, where we can connect faith and reason, where we can connect beliefs and values from religious sources, but also from people who would define themselves as not religious, for a kind of progressive agenda. And there are two concepts that I want to share with you, which I think articulate the potentiality of these new political spaces. The first one comes from political geographers, and it is the concept of progressive localism. Okay, so we're putting together two words, progressive and localism. The localism bit is clearly a reference to the kind of direction in which public policy has gone. I mean, not really, to be fair, since 2010. Localism, I think, was started by Mrs. Thatcher and certainly embraced with gusto by New Labour. So it's a kind of a narrative, a policy narrative that's been going on for about 30 years. And you know, I think we're all aware that the kind of narrative of localism is the decentralization of the state and its goods and services and functions to the local level, be that local authorities. But if you cut 40% off the local authorities and their ability to do that, therefore, you're actually explicitly relying more and more on what we might call civil society. So people's volunteering and, you know, ability and willingness to help their fellow neighbour becomes more and more a tool for delivering frontline goods and services, never mind support goods and services. And of course, the other dimension of localism is there is this kind of open market thing as well, where, you know, charities and non-businesses are having to compete with businesses for the tendering to run services, procurement of services. The people who came up with the term progressive localism say that that's austerity localism. That form of localism, which I've just described, is a kind of top-down, imposed, government, ideologically driven attempt to shoulder more and more responsibility and risk onto the shoulders of local communities in terms of what they have to provide. So they want to talk about progressive localism as an antithesis of austerity localism. And so the word progressive becomes important to think about. What do they talk about when they say progressive? Well, it's my first heckler. There we are. That's good. About time someone heckled me. Say, shut up, get on with it. So progressive, in the sense that they're using it, is not, as you might think, it's not about being elitist. It's not about being liberal. They're using the concept of progressive as simply meaning open, outward-facing, outward-looking. So for them, progressive localism is a localism that's constructed when groups in civil society and indeed public services and other social actors actually look out into the public sphere and see who they can work with. They're trying to create a more kind of organic, if you like, real sense of what localism could be. I'm going to read their definition of it. It's quite pithy, quite weighty, but because they're academics, but I think hopefully it will give you a gist of what they're trying to talk about. So for them, progressive localism is outward looking, that's what they say, and creates positive affinities between places and social groups, negotiating global processes. These processes are expansive in their geographical reach and productive of new relations between places and social groups, and can reinforce communities around emergent agendas for social justice, participation, and tolerance. So progressive localism creates positive affinities between places and social groups, negotiating global processes. So I think that's what it means. What progressive localism means in that context is that you could find yourself working with a partner, another institution, another organization, with a different mindset to yours, with a different kind of worldview, which under the ground rules of maybe a secular public state would have been problematic. Can we have religious and non-religious social actors coming together, sharing work and sharing why they do what they do? But I think in a post-secular public square, this isn't a problem, and this becomes a positive opportunity. This coming together of different social actors with different backgrounds, with different worldviews, but nevertheless identifying one thing that they want to do together, a pragmatic, ethical intervention that they want to make in their local community often, or around a single issue. And this becomes, I think, the basis of what I'm going to be talking later on about the new politics. When you find yourself in this situation, you might think, okay, I disagree with this person's view, let's say on same-sex marriage or, human rights. But do you know what? I'm not going to let that get in the way of what I'm going to do with this person, how we're going to work together. I'm going to give greater weight to what unites us. And the word affinities, I think, is a lovely word because it's not talking about formal partnerships. It's talking about a very blurred and organic kind of coming together of people who share a common agenda for change, but who will come at it from different ideological positions. And because they're geographers, they're saying, well, these affinities are not only good because they're bringing people together, but they actually rewrite, if you like, the kind of bureaucratic idea of what a space or what a community is. So these affinities don't respect local county council borders or parish council borders, or, you know what I mean? They kind of cross over these kind of, if you might say, artificially imposed spaces. The other thing I wanted to briefly talk about, I'm going to only talk for another 10 more minutes, so the end's in sight, is spiritual capital and its contribution to social capital. And I see a very close relationship between spiritual capital and progressive localism. Because if progressive localism is about new affinities, new political affinities, new partnerships, new comings together, new spaces of engagement between people of different beliefs and attitudes and worldviews, then what they're bringing to those spaces is their very selves. They're bringing their own deepest beliefs and values to these spaces. And I first discovered, if you like, or started writing about spiritual capital about 10 years ago, and I was looking at faith-based or church-based engagement in very sort of marginalised urban communities that were undergoing or waiting to be regenerated under the New Labour regeneration kind of project. And the government and Manchester City Council were very, very happy to receive the goods and services that these churches were providing these communities where there were very little goods and services left. They were very happy to receive the what. But when it came to talking about the why, there was no space for that. There was no space on funding forms. There was no space around the tables where these things were discussed to say that, well, the reason why faith groups are particularly effective at delivering welfare, why it's cost effective, why it's so resilient, is because it is directly engaged and connected to faith, to belief, what I would call spiritual capital. And faith groups, it seems to me, are particularly good at directly engaging their spiritual capital with practical action, so social capital. So for faith groups, there's a direct connection between their spiritual capital and social capital. And this spiritual capital, I said, was it's about a theological identity and worshipping tradition. So worship is very important as part of the generating the spiritual capital, but also a value system, moral vision, and a basis for faith. It is often embedded within local faith groups, but also expressed in the lives of individuals. So I was able to show in my research that the kind of direct correlation between spiritual capital and social capital, between the why and the what. And I was saying to policymakers, if you want to get the most out of faith groups, a lot of the faith groups were saying to me, well, we feel kind of excluded, we feel, marginalized, we feel that, we've been sort of, we're not allowed to be who we really are. If you want to heighten the impact of faith-based social welfare, then you've got to allow the spiritual capital to come in. But then I thought, okay, but if we're living in a post-secular society, if we're talking about progressive localism, it's not just religious people who have spiritual capital, is it? Most people have values and beliefs that influence the way that they participate in the public sphere. So I'm very interested, actually, I'm more interested in what I would call secular spiritual capital than I am about religious spiritual capital, because everyone writes about that and it's all well known. But what we don't understand very well is what drives, what motivates, what is the spiritual capital that engages people who define themselves as not religious to engage in the public sphere. So I want spiritual capital to be an inclusive category, and I want the churches and faith groups who are particularly effective, perhaps, at engaging with their spiritual capital to be places of hospitality and engagement where people can bring their spiritual capital and find that valorized and welcomed and affirmed, and then also find that they have a space where they can line up their deepest beliefs and attitudes and concerns for change with direct action. There's another kind of word from social psychology for that, and it's called eudaimonic happiness. Has anyone come across eudaimonic happiness? Just one person? Claire? Okay. Thank you. A few there. So eudaimonic happiness is what you might call deep happiness. Hedonic happiness is surface happiness. I'm feeling happy. The survey will say, how do you feel happy today? Do you feel sad? And you'll say, on a scale of 1 to 10, yes, I feel happy. Okay, that's hedonic happiness. But eudaimonic happiness is from the word daemon, the Greek word, which sometimes is translated as demon, but daemon actually means yourself, your true self. So eudaimonic happiness is that deeper happiness you have when your life is connected with your true daemon, your true self. Okay. I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up. So basically, Okay, so a case study. Let me just do one case study. I haven't got time to do two. So I've been talking a lot about the post-secular public sphere. I've been talking about progressive localism, and I've been talking about spiritual capital. How does this all come together? Well, I'm going to give an example, and if you excuse me reading it, of a Muslim food bank, which I was very privileged to hear the story of. We, with the Church Urban Fund and the joint public issues team, the William Temple Foundation, we had a conference just before the election, last election, where we highlighted how faith-based engagements in welfare are becoming new political hubs. They're not just about delivering welfare, they're becoming spaces where people come and participate, but also discuss and engage with what sort of society is being created. Okay? So this is a food bank in West London called Sufra, which has lots of connotations in the Middle East and Arabic world, connotations of hospitality and dining. I think the guy who runs it said it, in some places it simply means tablecloth. But a lovely kind of rich, inclusive metaphor, you might say. And it's opened up very recently, the last 18 months, I think. 90% of people who access their services are non-Muslims. It sees itself as an entry point for accessing other life opportunities. So, for example, they offer a food academy program training people to be chefs, to work in kitchens, accredited training for 16 to 25-year-olds. They run a vegetable box scheme, providing fresh produce at wholesale prices. And they also run a food growing project, so encouraging local people in Brent, which is where they're based, to grow their own food. The guy who runs it said that Sufra represents a new space for new generations of British Muslims, whereby they volunteer more and become engaged politically and practically to meet the needs of the local community of which they are part, rather than the more traditional route of Muslim almsgiving, which is to support the international Ummah, the international Muslim community. 50% of its funding and resources comes from other faith groups, including the local Catholic Church and the Jewish community. And it has a multi-faith workforce, including people from non-religious backgrounds. The director noted the changing relationship between the public sector and the voluntary sector, suggesting a blurring of lines. Sufra volunteers have been trained by staff from the council's housing department, something never seen before in Brent, and a radical change. Sufra was also a venue for pre-election hustings, suggesting that faith-based spaces of welfare are also becoming spaces of political debate and conscientization. I'm tempted to say a one-stop shop for all your political needs. You know, you can engage, you can contribute, you can discuss, you can debate, and you can go on to further things. So what does this type of space tell us about curating the new politics? So here's my final pitch. Thank you for listening so attentively. The new politics, as I see it, I want to come back to this word of new networks and affinities of citizens. The new politics is new networks and affinities of citizens increasingly turned off by party politics and economics, and who are seeking new spaces and opportunities where they can express a new desire for value-driven and ethically based participation in society. This is part of the wider shifts in globalization that have broken down traditional barriers and categorizations. We're all mixed up. But as I've said before, it's also part of this, what I'd call a postmodern search for authenticity and one's place in the world, what one might call a heightened subjectivity. So that's the new politics. And what about this word curate? What do I mean by that? Well, I'm using the word curate in two ways. I'm using it in the museum type way, which is where you kind of have a collection of artifacts and you have to arrange them in a space and create a coherent narrative that joins all these artifacts up. So it's about creating a space and creating a narrative. But also curate, I think, is about the proximity with the word curate. A curate is someone who has the cure of souls. who is responsible for the healing and well-being of the parish. So it seems to me that what faith groups do when they curate these new political spaces of engagement is they can, if they're up to the challenge and up to the task, curate these spaces in terms of creating a narrative, organising the components, not imposing on them, but creating a space where these components can come together and create a narrative. But it's also about curing individuals, but also structures. And I think at their best, when they are progressive, and of course that's a big if, faith groups hold these two things in particular tension. And I think that this ability of faith groups to curate political spaces in this way is a gift that will hopefully not only lead to a more resilient civil society, but I'm also questioning in my mind whether this is actually a way in which the church finds new life for itself. So can the church can some faith groups engaging in this type of work find this as a new way of not only revitalizing politics, but revitalizing themselves and spirituality? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Do you want to pick
Oh,
questions?
sorry. Yes, carry on. Yes.
Do you want to do a couple at a time?
Yes, do a couple at a time. Who else would like a comment?
Thanks, Chris. I think you seem to be coming round to... we could have reframed the title of your talk as Curating a New Religion,
Right.
and it would have worked just as
Yes,
well, it
yes,
seems to me.
yes.
I noticed you chose the word politics. Sorry, thank you. My vicar is sitting next to me, says I fit into all 6 of the non-believer categories you've identified. I think a Pew Research identified. Not sure that's true. But I'm on his PCC, but I call myself an agnostic.
Yes.
But I also call myself a Christian. And I'm interested in looking out at the community and what's going on and questioning stuff. And as long as something happening, it will engage me. So that will be true politically as well as it's... Yeah. True spiritually as well. And I think Linda Woodhead identified for the Church of England, the huge gap between the declining number of people who actually attend the church and the number who say 80% or more who say they actually are still Anglicans. But there's an opportunity of the church there, but it's moving away.
Yes.
And it seems to me that centralised religion is in danger. Local religion probably is looking for a bright future.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful statement here.
Thank you very much for what you said. I'm really inspired by the example that you gave as well, and many others like it, and I take part in some of those, which is great. But at the same time, I have this nagging idea in the back of my mind that isn't this somehow just letting the government off the hook, basically? So what would you say to that? Because I feel really strongly about that, and I work among food banks and things like that where we're actually now campaigning that we shouldn't have to be doing that because it's shocking. It's just outrageous. And it doesn't take someone with a rocket scientist or something to think up the idea, what if we all pile together as a society, all pitch in some money and then provide for those who can't provide for themselves? It's not difficult. And yet I feel like the government is being let off the hook if we continue to do this, although I do love those things when they do what you're saying, and I appreciate what you're saying as well.
Thank you very much. Very good questions there. Thank you. Yeah, round of applause. Yes, please. Don't hold back. So I take your point absolutely. I think church localism is what does that look like? And that's part of the kind of reconceptualizing and re-understanding, and not the message of the church, but the structure of the church. So what I'm trying to say is, are we open to exploring new structures, which we might not even call church, but we would call hubs or spaces of flourishing, but we take the active role in curating them. We may be implicit sometimes, but we have to be absolutely explicit that this is what we're doing and this is what we're about, and this is part of our fulfillment to work for the common good. And I think it's happening by default, and it's happening all over the place, but it's very hard to get an overall picture of how that's going to be in the next 5 years. But that's very important work needs to be done. The thing about letting the government off the hook, yes, absolutely. So as well as the kind of curating, there is the prophetic modelling of alternative spaces and alternative visionaries. And I think people are just as hungry for alternative visions, and we must make sure that we don't become so pragmatic and so proactive, beavering away in our little corners, that we lose the meta-narrative of bringing the kingdom of God and what it says to the city, the Augustinian thing there. So yes, a couple here, and one right at the back. Can we take the three, please?
What I have felt very uncomfortable with, and thank goodness that we haven't heard the word for a long time now, is the big society.
Yes.
Where the big society is, in my belief, an excuse for the government to make cuts in public spending and use volunteering to take over from paid jobs and so forth. But at the same time, there is a need and a place for volunteering, and it comes into a place of its own, as well as the need for spending on public services and so on. And where can we draw the line and bring the balance between encouraging volunteering within society as well as putting pressure on the government and local authorities to meet their responsibilities as well?
Thank you.
Just a thought about the food banks. I'm minister at a church in one of the most deprived areas of Salford, and we have a food bank. And I'm not sure we do let the government off the hook with the provision that we have, because actually, from what I see of government policy and the people who present to the food bank, the government are really happy just to set a whole section of society that just doesn't matter and don't care about. And I think what we are with the food banks is a reminder of the failure and the importance of stressing the humanity of those people for whom, as far as the government concerned, they don't matter, they're scroungers, it's their own fault. And I think if we do it properly, we can actually be a real thorn in the side of a very unfair policy.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Where was I going with that?
In the green.
Whoops, nearly treading on people's hands. Thanks.
I've just come from the talk that Giles Fraser did, and this is kind of just a bit of an unformed thought, but he was talking quite a lot about the original helplessness and vulnerability, and that being a unique and authentic contribution that the church brings, that we talk about the understanding of a desire and that not being immediately met, which is very countercultural in that we have desires that are met very immediately. And I've been thinking a bit about how politics really often shies away from that vulnerability, and that leading politicians are never able to say that there's, or to articulate a desire for society without coming with a ready-made solution, which is often the state will do it, And I feel maybe that's something that that the church can be and should be stepping into that space to be talking about how do we articulate a desire for the future without being able without having to realise it straight away. And if politicians, and I feel that's sort of what Jeremy Corbyn, or that whole factor, is kind of about, that he hasn't kept his card so close to his chest and said, this is the problem and this is the solution, straight out, but has been able to express some level of vulnerability in that sort of openness of painting a bigger picture of where politics is going. I wonder what you thought about that.
Thank you very much. Thanks. So some great questions there. The tension between volunteering and encouraging volunteering and valuing it properly, and the idea that the state has got certain responsibilities that it should live up to. I think this is where Temple was at his best with his thinking, because as I intimated at the beginning, he said the role of the state is not to well, he said that the heart of society is relationality. So it's relationships. Relationships create strong democracy, resilient communities. So writing in the context of, totalitarianism, Nazism, the Soviet Empire, he wasn't interested in another big state, but he said if we want to avoid another slip into totalitarian government, if we want to create, sustainable local communities, the role of the state is to provide a basic framework for human flourishing. So that is the role of the state. Because without that those basic building blocks of human flourishing, you can't participate as a volunteer or indeed anything. So hence his call for, access to healthcare, education, decent housing, the welfare state on one page, basically. Because he said that when the state does that, all the state really should be doing then is what he calls nurturing intermediate groupings. And intermediate groupings for him were those groupings within civil society where people could engage at a face-to-face level with other people locally to create, a more flourishing human society. So for him, the main policy driver actually, when it came to sort of creating a holistic society, were these intermediate groupings, because this is where you could, it was face-to-face, it was personal, it was a small enough scale. And the state was there really to nurture those through the provision of goods and services. And I think, obviously, what we've moved to now is, 36% state or whatever it is. There's very little rhetoric coming from the state about that kind of vision. Thank you very much for saying yes. The food banks are a constant reminder of an underclass, a precariat. I think they are listened to, but again, is it just too easy for the government to shrug its shoulders? I don't know whether we should be making more political capital out of that. And the business about vulnerability and not going for the quick fix, I totally take that on board. I think curating has an element of that, in a sense that you could say curating is about holding open something. I did say it was a bit about imposing a narrative, but it could also be just caring, creating a space where people are allowed to fail, where people are allowed to discover and experiment. So I probably need to do a bit more work around curating in the light of what you've said and what Giles has said. So thank you for that suggestion. How that becomes a political dimension, I'm still not quite sure. But thank you.
I just wondered if you can be a bit prophetic for us. Within this country, do you see these partnerships supplementing statutory provision or replacing statutory provision, or do you see statutory provision actually reducing anyway because laws will change and the government's requirement to meet some of these? This is the problem with the partnerships and with church provision, is that it's good and I love everything you're saying, but people will fall through the net because it's not statutory. So I just wonder how you see us working with government in that or not.
A couple more questions at the back there. Thank you.
Reflection and a question. I think the first is, churches stepped forward, filled the space that food banks were desperately needed, reinvented ecumenical work. It's quite an amazing act of transformation. However, I'm concerned that locally the churches will begin to shy away from even more awkward questions about race, potentially about class, about those who are being ignored because we're doing something and we can touch it and we can feel it, therefore we've done what we can. Which links partly to my question, where in your narrative and your bigger picture story does the international perspective come in? Where do we continue to challenge the church not just to look locally and think, unless we sort it locally, we can't do it internationally? Because my concern is that we might become hyper-local and then forget the rest of the globe.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there was one other, yes, the gentleman in the brown waving his hand. And then, Niall, yeah, one more here.
My question's what you were alluding to about the state, and it almost felt like you were going into an idea of theocracy, that we should almost reimagine the state as being based on Christian principles. I think that's, even for people within the church, that's quite a difficult concept. And I'd like to hear more about that. And one thing that strikes me is if you've got one overarching narrative as you're sort of reaching for, that's quite it doesn't work for everyone. I think I'm not a modernist. I think I'm a postmodernist. I think it seems like there's so many different narratives and they're all competing, and it seems like we can't get that grand narrative that fuses society. As the cohesive society you're talking about, it's difficult to engender from any one position. The only thing I can think of that does sum that up is the environmental movement, because that's about the earth itself.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can everyone has a stake in that. And I don't think everyone does have a stake in religion or in politics or in helping the poor or however you see it. So, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you very much. And Neil, just here.
Thanks, Chris. Some of these are new questions, but some of them are old ones. I mean, it's not like the church has never been involved in social action,
No.
or indeed hustings or politics. For me, the challenge is how you fuse the local and the national, because for me, it's not a good enough answer to say politics is local. Power is held nationally and globally. So how do we fuse what you're describing as the new politics into a powerful movement?
Yeah.
Now, how do thousands of people in food banks
Yeah.
become a political force and not just a kind of a surrogate arm of the state?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and
Can
one
you
that
do all of that in 3 minutes?
lies totally beyond the purview of this. But that's for another lecture. Okay, so very quickly, I think ideally it's complementary, not supplementary, because I think what you want is to somehow harness the creativity and innovation that's going on in local partnerships, and somehow then create a feedback loop so that that feeds into kind of other forms of government policy. I don't know whether that's possible or not, but I think ideally it's a complementary relationship, but I suspect in reality it's a supplementary one. But let's hold on to the complementary if we can. Yes, so yes, Christian narratives. Yeah, well, Temple, I mean, he was writing at a time when, he was probably a very powerful archbishop. I mean, people listened to what he said. And I suppose you could say in the 1940s, there was still a kind of enough religious literacy around for people to understand what he said when he talked about building a just and fair society on Christian principles. But to be fair to him, he didn't just use Christian principles. So he had this idea of middle axioms, which were broad public policy areas of engagement that were derived from theological but also philosophical roots and indeed scientific. So part of his case for the welfare state, and he was the person who coined that, was that he looked at social science and he looked at reports that said, he talked about the long-term impact of unemployment and how that created hopelessness and despair. He was a philosopher, so he brought in a lot of natural philosophy, natural law. So it was a synthesis of various meta-narratives. But clearly for him, the Christian one was the one that was the sort of... So I think the answer to your question, we do need to find a meta-narrative. We do, because as you say, there's so many narratives that nothing's going to happen, but we need to understand what are the various sources from which that meta-narrative could come. And some of them will be religious, and some of them will be non-religious. And I think I've heard the phrase the New Enlightenment, which is about, can we create a new enlightenment where there isn't a false dichotomy between religious wisdom and scientific wisdom, but can we create a new enlightenment where these are not seen as oppositional but complementary? So that's something to go away work on. Sorry, there was another... international. And I think it relates a bit to what I was saying about national. How can we upgrade these local initiatives so they have international impact? I think what religions have, and I don't think this is exploited enough, is that they are already globalized. They fit into the new globalized modernity very well because they do have both a local component and a national component and an international component. So I look at someone like the Pope Francis and his pioneering work, you might say, on environment, coming back to your point earlier about the environment being maybe a new area for a common good political narrative. So when the Pope and Naomi Klein get together, That for me is an example of post-secular politics at its best. And things like that probably hopefully will have a breakthrough impact that then has political traction. I'm afraid that's all I could probably say in this time. Very quickly, though, there will be, if you don't mind, there's just two things coming round as you go. One is a leaflet about William Temple Foundation and what we do. And if you want to know more about us, then please visit our website. The other is a public lecture I'm doing at the University of Chester, which is called Globalized Religion in an Era of Uncertainty. What prospects for a new global ethic of progressive change? So I'm going to be looking at religions, not just Christianity. And that's a free lecture at the University of Chester. So if you're in the Northwest, on the 22nd of September, it'd be lovely to see you. Thank you very much for listening and questions. Thank you.